Hi, my name is Meredith, and I have just recently gotten myself out of a revision slump. What I'm talking about is the period between your first draft and second draft and doing a giant developmental edit and coming up with a plan for that and saying, how on earth am I supposed to figure out what needs to happen to get this from a first draft to a second draft? Yeah, I pulled myself out of that. I wanted to just basically talk about the things that I did that helped me to pull myself out of that and figure out a plan to move forward. Since when I started this, I looked for resources on this and I didn't find many. Okay, so the most important one is organization. That was my biggest problem with my draft is I was like, it's so unorganized. I don't know how to tackle what needs to be tackled first or most important. I only have limited time. I can't just create a revision plan for 5 years. I mean, some people can. I don't want to. So I need to prioritize. And what helped me to do that is to be organized. First things first, reverse outline. I will say this at all times. So if you haven't seen my video on reverse outlining, that's what I'm talking about. You can go watch it there. Lots of different kinds of reverse outlining, but the kind that helped me the most in this process was a scene list. Very, very simple. A list of every single scene that you wrote in your book. It's just a blueprint. And so basically, I'm keeping one of those unedited so that always I can look back on it and know what I had. And then I'm taking a copy of it. And on that scene list, I completely edited it to what I want it to be. And I used this as my master list where I kept every translated thought of, I need to fix this, into here's how I'm fixing it. This scene list that I edited has layer after layer after layer of revision. Like every stray thought that I had that I was like, oh, this scene needs to be different in this way. I would go in, find the scene, and I would change it all in one spot. My thoughts were not scattered around. They were translated into actionable steps for what needs to happen when I go in and actually revise the manuscript. So that's what I mean by organized. Try to have places for your thoughts that make sense to you and that you can always go back and find and that you know are going to be helpful for you when you actually go into the revision step. Another thing that I did to organize was I created a list of major issues that needed to be either solved or I knew how to solve them, but they need to be completely fixed throughout the entire manuscript. I listed them literally just like, I don't know, I think I got up to like 80 bullet points. Yeah, my book had a lot of major issues. The point with this list is to check off every single bullet point before I go back into my revision work, or at least to say, this isn't important in this draft to get right, and I'm okay with that. So I'll demote that in priority. And so it helped me to see, like, okay, what are the major issues that I cannot go into my revisions without actually figuring out first? So it tied down all the loose threads that I was worried about and that have been just floating in my head for like months, years even. And it let me see every single big issue that I have and give me a chance to tackle it and at least come up with a couple possible answers right under the bullet point. And then eventually I would sort through them, figure out which ones were good and bad, and toss out the ones that were bad, keep the ones that were good. So major issues list, really great way to keep all of your concerns about your book organized. One more point on keeping organized is pulling out separate threads. I think I've talked about this in a couple of my previous videos recently because this is what I've been doing mainly to create a revision plan. And so this has really been on my mind, but I just thought I'd mention it here because it's part of the organizational structure of what I'm doing. Every book has several threads. I'm not even talking subplots. One character's motivations, one person's character arc, the romance or the bad guy's plan. There are lots of things that are continuous because you're talking about multiple people moving through a plot, a series of events. And sometimes those things can become inconsistent or they can create plot holes if you're not following one through. And so what I did is I pulled out the different threads and I would work on one at a time and make sure that one was consistent and that one was how I wanted it. Working on those alone gave me so much clarity about them. And so then once I was satisfied with how each thread was separately, working on it in a separate document, then I would take those actionable changes and then I would implement them back into the master scene list. And I would say, okay, I don't like the way that this scene portrayed this thread, so I'm going to tweak it in this way so that this thread is consistent. And I did that for many things, many character arcs, many different plot archetypes. The mystery plot, the romance plot, all that stuff was tweaked separately and then added back in. And that is the bulk of the work that I did. And it has really, really made the plot beautiful. Okay, the next couple are mental tricks for motivation and just getting you actually to work on the book. There's not that much that I can actually give you about how to fix your book, right? Like you have to do that work. And these tips are basically just to get you to sit down with it. So let's talk about it. The best thing that I did was, as I was going through and kind of setting up all this organizational stuff, I kept thinking of like tasks I needed to do. Like, okay, outline this thing, like plot out this thing, like write out this character's backstory because I have no idea what's going on. And so I kept a list of tasks to do that I knew would be beneficial for me and for the story. And this is different from the major issues list because the major issues is just like, at some point, fix this. The task list is like, here's an actionable step I could take to make my story better or to give me a better understanding of it. So, the purpose of this is to, whenever you sit down to work on your book, to never be at a loss with what you can do. Whenever I would sit down to work on my book and I wasn't in the middle of a task, I would go to the task list and I would say, okay, I'm going to check one of these off. So, I'm going to just do something on the list. And it would instantly get me into the story because I had already set out a path for myself. It was like giving myself homework. And it was just like, well, I just have to do the homework. And so then I would literally just generate ideas by doing the homework. And then I would figure out what was the most important homework to do. And I would prioritize that. So a task list was awesome. Very simple motivation for actually sitting down and doing stuff towards the story. This is a separate but adjacent tip, which is don't avoid it, just spend time with it. If you come back to it after letting it sit for a while and you say, it's time to work on this, like especially if you're terrified of it or you don't know what to do next, or if you're just like really overwhelmed and intimidated, try to spend time with it rather than avoiding that task. Spending time can look like so many different things. It can mean just like doing things that aren't necessarily high priority, organizing a character sheet, writing up an interview with your character just to get to know them more, like something fun and exciting for you that feels vivid in your mind to actually just to get you to work on your story and to spend time with it. Because if you just avoid it, overall, you'll never make progress. Just put yourself in the path of your story and watch what happens. Another thing to consider is that time of day matters. Like, it matters. I'm not going to tell you what time of day matters for you, but for me, it's the morning. There is something magical about early morning when I've had enough sleep. Ideas come together, and my concentration is so crystal clear, the book just sews itself together when I work on it in the morning. If I do it literally after I've done anything else in the day, like even a post on social media or working out or obviously going to work, my concentration is shattered. And there's just nothing like that early morning for me. So for you, this could be afternoon slump is like when your mind winds down and you are just ready to do something other than work. So it could be that for you, or it could be late at night. There are a lot of late at night writers. Find the time when your brain is crystal clear and make use of it, especially in this stage where there's so much brainstorming going on. Like you're really relying on a muscle that needs clarity. My last big tip for getting yourself out of a revision slump is to read like nobody's business. I have read 15 books so far this year. January, February, it's been 2.5 months. I've never done this before in my entire life. And I don't know exactly what's happening, but I know that I need it to happen. In order to get enough content and ideas, I need to know what this genre is about. I need to know what's out there. I need to know what people like. That is really a huge suggestion that I have, is just read as much as you can when you're in this phase. Because your brain needs input, because it's like back to spontaneous generation. And it just, it needs something to chew on in order to create this new content and to figure out the best decisions to make. And along with fiction books, writing craft books, I think I've probably said this a lot, but just to have all the information on this together in this one video, I love reading a writing craft book alongside of a brainstorming process, because reading about different parts of the writing process or whatever suggestions that these authors are giving me, it's going to generate ideas about my own story, because I'm like, oh, they're focusing my attention on, how the midpoint is supposed to work. And so then I'm getting ideas for my midpoint. And it's like just a really good way to focus on your story by also doing something productive and something that's educational. Throughout this process, I read The Story Equation, really tiny book, and The Story Grid, ginormous textbook. So that was kind of my fodder for this period. And I'm also starting to read The Story Genius and Wired for Story by Lisa Cron. I just find that reading writing craft books really centers my brain in thinking through the story a little bit better than really anything else does. Okay, those are all my actionable tips, but just some last thoughts about the mindset of this stage, since it is a really tricky place to be. 3 things. Number 1, you are not trying to pull this information and these new ideas out of nowhere. And to me, that's really encouraging. Some people like that stage a lot, the brainstorming when you have nothing. I don't like that. That makes me feel like I'm not standing on anything. Like I have nowhere to plant my feet. So how am I supposed to pull these ideas out of nowhere? I don't have to come up with everything from scratch. I have a lot. I just have to sort through it. Like I just have to bask in the story I've already created. And so it's, to me, way, way less work and way less daunting than the brainstorm of coming up with everything in the first place. Number two, like I already said, you have limited time to be in this revision stage of revising from first draft to second draft. So prioritize what you need to get done in order to move forward because you don't want to be here indefinitely. And this can be an analysis paralysis stage where you just never move on because it's like, I'll never know if things are perfect. So I'm never going to like go in and fix it because I don't know if I'm ready to fix it yet. And so you need to not do that, but to prioritize the things that are going to help you actually dig into that second draft and make the book better. So people's brains work differently. Some people like to do developmental and smaller edits at the same time and just like one big pass through the book and just like do that over and over. I really do think that like going through and like making sure your developmental stuff is really good and like working on that and leaving the little stuff for later is definitely good practice. That's definitely the most common advice. But I mean, it's so that you don't waste time, so that you know when you're going into that revision that the stuff that you're revising is worth your time, right? It's like this is the stuff that's going to create the better scaffold. And so that when I go back in on my third, my fourth, my fifth revision, that I know that I'm putting stuff into this skeleton that's correctly arranged and assembled. So prioritize what you need to. Ask yourself what questions can't be left unanswered when I go and start the revisions on draft two. And answer those questions. Prioritize those. Don't just stick with the easy stuff, the fun stuff, the fluff. Get into the hard stuff. And number three, think about your goals for your revision phase. Underwriters may want to think about complicating things, adding depth, adding layers, creating more meaningful connections between characters, and creating more complex emotions and motivations and tying in more backstory. And if you're an overwriter like me, you're probably thinking about how to cut things down, how to simplify rather than complicate. Have that at the forefront of your mind. How can I make this more streamlined? How can I make this clearer and cleaner? And obviously full of conflict and tension and layers and depth and all that good stuff. But like if something's overcomplicated and just way bloated in the word count, figure out how to cut and simplify. So different writers are going to be prioritizing different things at this stage. Figure out what you need to be focusing on and make sure that you have that at the forefront of your mind when you're doing this revision plan stage. So that's everything I've learned from the past 2 months of creating a revision plan. That's what's worked for me this time. I felt like this was a really valuable way of getting through these revisions, and I made tons of progress in the past 2 months. Like I am blown away by how much progress I made and how clearly I was able to think through the book, even not spending that much time. I think I spent like an hour average a day on it or less. I hope some of these tips were helpful for you. As always, remember that everybody's brain works different and that some of these tips might be helpful for me because of the way I work, maybe more organization focused, and that might not work for you. So take everything with a grain of salt, and I hope you figure out what works best for you. Okay, that's everything for today. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.